Hello, everybody. Back at it now. Hope your week's going okay. Today's April 2nd. We are starting our first of two videos for this week. We will be covering the Great Depression today, and then probably next 2 days, like usual, I'll be hitting World War II. A couple reminders. Some of you have not added to discussions. Some of you didn't do the assignment that's on there. Let me urge you to get that done as soon as possible. Like I said, if you haven't done the discussion, send me an email with your thoughts about them and go back and rewatch them if you need to. It's going to affect your grade if you don't get those into me. We have, counting this week, 2 weeks left of this, and then that's it. So let's push through and get done, but be as diligent as you can. The best thing, if you're struggling with something, email me and talk to me, and I'll be happy to help you out. It's a lot easier for me to know if there's something going on or you're struggling, and I haven't heard from a few of you, which makes me a little nervous. So please reach out and talk to me, and I'll send email reminding you about that. For this week, we are going to look at the Great Depression, like I said, in World War II. There are a couple things I want you to read and answer, like the Roaring Twenties, so please get that done. All that counts in collectively to your grade, which I'm going to be taking more into consideration given how kind of difficult this is. So for those that stay prompt, are adding the discussions, are completing the assignments, watching the videos, those are the ones I'm really paying attention to when I give you your final grade in a couple weeks. Okay, so any questions, let me know. Your grade should be updated with midterms and quizzes. We'll have one more quiz that is due on the last day. Well, actually, in 2 weeks, I'll talk about it. I'll give you some time to do it. And then, of course, the final. Also, don't forget about the review paper. There is guidelines online. If you have questions about it, let me know. Remember, you're choosing a topic of your choice, and you are writing about something that is interesting, a hobby preferably, in the history of it. Okay? So, questions, I know there's a lot there. Please let me know as soon as possible. Okay, well, let's get moving here because there's a lot to talk about today, and I want to try to get through this video as fast as I can. Well, let's talk about the concept of hard times. You know, the Roaring Twenties, the 1920s, all the fun things we talked about, the modernization, all the fun things, is often connected with summer. The 1930s is the winter time. And we had a great summer, but now things are going to be hard. And so keep that in mind as we look at these 2 decades and how they work together. Now, you will not understand the 1930s very well if you don't get the 1920s. So make sure you go back there and you watch that so you see how we're living in this luxurious time, but things are about ready to fall apart. Okay, well, let's start with one of my favorite movies and one of my favorite books. So Steinbeck, I'm actually going to end our presentation today on a conversation about John Steinbeck, was one of the great American authors, and he had written, during the 1930s, many great books. 2 of the more famous ones would be Of Mice and Men, and my favorite, of course, the classic, his masterpiece is The Grapes of Wrath. And The Grapes of Wrath, you've never seen it. It's made in 1940, but I'm telling you, it is worth the watch. It's awesome. It's got one of my favorite actors ever, which is Henry Fonda. And it's the story of this family that's struggling in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. And if you're not very familiar with that, I'm going to talk about it at the end of the presentation today. But I thought it would be good to start with this video because it talks about something that we really need to consider as we're looking forward today. And that is about blame. Whose fault is this? Who should we go after? I want you to keep that in mind here as we start talking today. Who do we really blame for the struggles of the 1930s, the Great Depression, the hardest time in American history? Some people say at least economically. So with that said, let's watch this interesting clip.
They told me to tell you to get off, and that's what I'm telling you.
You mean get off my own land?
Now, don't go to blaming me. It ain't my fault.
Whose fault is it?
You know who owns the land, the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company.
And who's the Shawnee Land and Cattle Company?
It ain't nobody. It's a company.
They got a president, ain't they? They got somebody who knows what a shotgun's for, ain't they?
Oh, son, it ain't his fault because the bank tells him what to do.
All right. Where's the bank?
Tulsa. What's the use of picking on him? He ain't nothing but the manager. And he's half crazy himself trying to keep up with his orders from the east.
Then who do we shoot?
Brother, I don't know.
Okay. Isn't that really the question at hand? You know, who do we shoot? And I love this idea of he's asking about all these different people. Whose fault is it? And this guy comes up. He says, it's nobody's fault. We can't find out who to really
What decade
blame.
are we in? I have to be.
So, with that said, let's look at something called the bull market and what we identify as the stock market crash. During the 1920s, stocks prices rose rapidly. And I'm going to explain what a stock is today in case you don't know. A very basic idea. But the market has this great moment in 1929, and then it just crashes in the end of October. And so let's talk about why that is. Excuse me, I always say that majority of people know that the stock market crashed, but I would say very few people out there could actually tell you why. So I'm going to put you in a small percentage of people in America today to help you explain what happens and to really get it. And of course, there's layers here. Economics, there's layers to economics. But to get the basic ideas, we're going to cover 5 different ideas. It'd very be smart for you guys to write these down. I'm going to cover them one by one. The first is supply and demand. Then we're going to look at speculation. Then a concept called buying on margin. And then boom and bust, and then panic, okay? So let's start with supply and demand. And let's look at famous inventions of the 1920s here. So you've got lots of things that we still use today. I want you to take a second, look over them, think about them. But then let me ask you this very important question. Looking at all these items, which one of these do you need more than one? You start kind of looking at it and thinking, okay, which ones do I need more than one of these? And as you're looking through these, you're probably going to come to the conclusion that most of them you do not need more than one. And that is at the heart of the first conversation we're going to have today about supply and demand, which is the first part leading us. Okay. Let's go back to 1926. We're going to go back 3 years ago, and then we're going to kind of move forward to 1929. And stick with me here. I really want you guys to get this because a lot of people pass through this not understanding why the stock market crashed, how this ended up blowing up in our face. So let's look at 1926. America is doing great in 1926, okay? There's lots of money going around. Post-World War I, we come out of this pretty unscathed. And businesses are booming, right? It's not unlike, look, we're seeing this happen, last few years. And now, of course, we're in kind of this time where we're sort of struggling right now. We're not sure what the future is going to look like with this all. But, that's a big deal. Okay, so let's take a quick look at what's happening. And I'm going to give you 2 companies, okay? That I'm going to give you one that existed back then, G&E, General Electric. And then I'm going to give you, I think it's just GE, isn't it? Let's just call it General Electric. Like an idiot here. And the other one we're just going to call it Bob's Washing Machines, all right? Now in 1926, both General Electric, and this is for real, but Bob's Washing Machines we're going to really focus on, is rocking. It's rocking. It's selling so many washing machines. It cannot keep up with the demand for washing machines, okay? So I'm sitting here as owner of Bob's Washing Machine, and I'm like, my gosh, I've got to keep making more. So I'm building as fast as I can. I'm selling. Everything's going smooth. All right, so let's talk about a stock. Now, does anyone know what we mean when we say stock? When you buy a stock, you are buying a part of the company, right? Now, stick with me because this is part of the whole story here. So when you look around and you're playing the stock market, a lot of retirements are this way, right? You're diversifying in different companies. You're not going to own a lot. Let's say you want to buy stock today in Coca-Cola, right? Well, just to buy a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of Coke, you're going to be spending quite a bit of money. So it doesn't necessarily equal out unless Coke's going to go even higher than it is, which they're pretty high up there. So where people really make money is the risk, right? When you find a company that nobody knows anything about, potential, but ends up being this amazing company. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's go back to 2003, for example. All right, 2003. Some of you remember this. Most of you do not. Let's say 2003, you've got a couple options. Let's say you want to buy some stock. Okay. There's a group called Alta Vista that looks really good. Now, Alta Vista is the top search engine company in 2003, at least one of them and Yahoo. So if you are not going to be risky, you're going to put all your money into Alta Vista to play it safe. It's probably a company that's going to serve. Everybody's using the internet, right? You could probably go safe there. However, there's a new company that merges on the scene. It's kind of weird. It's called like Google or something. Oh, that's right, Google. And nobody knows anything about it. But let's say you're going to be risky and you're going to put some money into Google. All right. Now, you put all like $5,000 into Google in 2003, 2020, you're probably a millionaire, right? That's the risk of the stock market. Where if you put it Alta Vista, of course, this company just dies out. But let's say you put it into Coke. It's probably, Coke was popular in 2003. It's popular in 2020. Same thing. So what you need to pay attention to is that how the stock market works is the way you make money is you find the companies that are up and coming. Okay, so let's go back to 1926. Now you understand how this works. Well, let's say you want to invest in Bob's washing machines. General Electric stable. It was stable then. It was stable now, though it won't be stable during the Great Depression. But let's say Bob's washing machine. It's cheaper stocks, and they are selling left and right. So you're going to put money into Bob's washing machine. Okay, now let me get my eraser up here because I need a little bit more. Oh, I didn't mean to erase the whole freaking scheme. Let's come back to Bob's. I guess you can go back and look at that if you need to. Okay. So we're going to call Bob's washing machine, Bob's WN. Let's say you throw some money in there. Now, as 1927 comes around, in 1928, something starts to happen to Bob's washing machine. And the problem is that everybody's bought a washing machine. Now, here's the thing that we've learned about, and we'll kind of talk about this. But, back then, washing machines were pretty simple. And if they broke, you just went to the Star Wars store and got a little lug nut or something and fixed it. So you only need one and they last a long time. So Bob's washing machines, all of a sudden, they're not selling like they should. The demand has dropped. But the problem is Bob had this, and that leads us to our next term here. Let's go back and look at it. Speculation. Bob has speculated that he's going to keep selling washing machines, so he keeps building. You can see where we're going here, can't you? Now, all of a sudden, 1927, 1928, Bob's not able to sell his washing machines anymore, right? This is the dangerous part of speculation. You speculate how your company's going to do. You invest in it. If it doesn't do too hot, then you're in trouble. Okay, so now you're starting to see we're starting problems. Now, Bob's not the only one, because come back to those inventions. Lots of inventions here. And there's only a couple that you need more than one of, right? Now, how do they get around this today, right? Well, the phone's a perfect example. They have convinced us that this phone is going to be useless. Now, I bought this phone almost 2 years ago. I think it's the 8 or whatever. Now, it still has the thumbprint. It doesn't have the Face ID. It doesn't have the better camera. So I'm going to need to turn this in a couple of years, right? So they see what companies have done. They've made products become obsolete in the matter of a couple of years. The problem is with this new technology, they hadn't figured that out early. So they're building all of these things, and they're building them to last. And that is great for the consumer, not so great for the company. I hope everybody's seeing where we're going here. Okay, the next comes to buying on margin. Okay, and that's the third part. And I'm going to let David Shea, who is a kind of an economist, explain to you this problem. And I'm going to kind of pause it here and there so you get the idea of buying on margin and some of the issues that come with it and what it means.
During the 1920s, the United States experienced unprecedented prosperity, in part because the United States emerged from World War I largely unscathed, both physically and financially, compared to Europe. So the United States enjoyed a competitive advantage in the 1920s over the European nations that were struggling to rebuild their economies after the prolonged and devastating war. At the same time, during the 1920s, there developed an array of exciting new industries and new products, new technologies. The airplane, the automobile, the radio, the cinema. These were very fast-growing industries during the 1920s.
Kind of what we're talking about, right? All of these companies, all this, it's exciting time. Everything new is coming in.
And as a result, people began to invest in the stocks of these new industries. The problem was that the stock market was under-regulated. And as the stock market rose in value, more and more people invested in the stock market, thinking that it was going to continue to grow permanently. In fact, some of the leading economists in the nations talked about perpetual prosperity in the United States. And as so often happens with the dynamics of a capitalist system, greed overtook reason. And as people grew more and more greedy, as they saw their profits rising, they continued to invest more and more in the stock market. Another factor was that taxes were very low in the 1920s, so more and more consumers had more money to invest because
and that's all about those presidents. We talk about those laissez-faire presidents who lowered taxes so consumers had more money.
Paying high taxes that they had to pay during the war years, and they were putting that money into the stock market. Finally, the unregulated stock market developed some practices that led Herbert Hoover, the president, in 1929 to talk about an orgy of financial speculation taking over the stock market. What he meant by that was that people were able to buy stocks in the 1920s on what was called margin, buy on margin. And what that simply meant was that instead of having to pay $100 for a $100 stock, people could buy that stock for only $10, and the rest was on margin. In essence, they were borrowing against their stock, assuming that its price would continue to rise, and they could pay for the stock with the profits that the stock was accruing. Unfortunately, all of that began to collapse in October of 1929, when suddenly all of this superstructure that was driving the stock market began to crumble and implode upon itself, because it was built on fantasy rather than the reality of the American economy. In the fall of 1929, as stock prices plummeted, stockbrokers had to call their customers and say, "You've got to pay me your margin." Well, people didn't have any cash to pay their margins. In other words, they had borrowed money to buy the stock in the first place, and now they didn't have money because their stocks had collapsed. That created a terrible financial pinch that began to radiate throughout the economy as people became cash short because their stocks lost so much in value. It was during that fall of 1929 that the stock market plummeted so fast and so far that many stockbrokers and stock owners jumped out of buildings and committed suicide because it was so bad. So when
11
crashed,
of them actually on one day jumped out of buildings. 11, just to show you how bad it was. Okay. I think we got the basic ideas there. What we call Black Tuesday is what he's talking about. October 29th, 1929, stock market crashes and everyone is in big panic. Now, this is significant. We're seeing somewhat of this happening today. We're seeing the stock markets plummet and we're dealing with what this looks like. And Trump is trying to figure this out. And so one thing you talk about in the discussion today or this week is this idea of, are we headed towards another crash? Will we be able to stop it? You know, the stimulus package that came through, part of it was to help businesses so we don't deal with this. And that was one thing that maybe we've tried to learn from. We learned from in 2009 as well with the big recession, is the government sort of doesn't get involved here. And we'll talk about that, but they don't really have the philosophy to get too far involved. Okay, so by 1930, everybody's losing their jobs. And this is probably higher. In fact, some people think the unemployment rate probably went closer to 26, 27% at one point. And this is because companies now, think about if you were working at Bob's Washing Machine and you had a job where you made all those washing machines. Well, all of a sudden, you don't have a job anymore. Nobody's buying them. And so you get laid off. So layoffs are constantly happening. I want to show you a couple pictures as we're moving forward here and kind of think about what this picture shows, it tells us. This concept of the homeless man takes on a new meaning during the Great Depression. You see someone homeless today, first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is, oh, well, this guy probably just doesn't want to work, or he's an alcoholic. That's not the story here with so many people in the 1930s. These are not people who lost jobs because they're careless or reckless or because of alcoholism or depression or mental illness, which again has its own issues. I'm not saying that this is something that we shouldn't talk about, but what we're talking about here are people that just average American workers that can't find a job. Okay, so a couple things to write down. This is the worst economic crisis in American history. And it left, and it's very important, I want you to think about this term psychic scars. What would be interesting in the discussion if anybody wanted to talk about where they see these psychic scars today. And I'm going to give you a couple examples where I've seen them so you can know what you're talking about. Psychic scars are trauma that have been left over that you see. And my grandma and my wife's grandma, we were talking about this, they had some of this. So for example, my grandma used to wash out Ziploc bags because you never know when you're going to use them again. My wife's grandma used to save everything. They would save salt and pepper shaker, like little bags that you'd get at Wendy's. And there were when we cleaned out their house, hundreds, thousands of them. You save everything. This idea of becoming a penny pincher. And I want you to think about if your grandparents saw that. How many people had grandparents have these psychic scars? Maybe you could share an example of that if you would like. I mean, how bad was it? Well, let's just look at New York City, right? You got 6,000 people walking around the city trying to sell apples for 5 cents each. Many of these people were doctors and lawyers, teachers, educated businessmen, and now this is it. I mean, just to give you an idea how big of a gut hit this is, a gut punch. 40% is how much the average income dropped for the American family. So if you're making $2,300, which was the average in 1932, you're making $1,500. Think about what your salary is today, whatever that is, and divide that by 40% and see where you are, right? It's going to change the way you live your life. Well, let's back up a little bit. One of the things that we're looking at here is how popular Herbert Hoover was before the crash was. And rightly so, just like David Shee said in the video, everybody's doing great. You know what I mean? The economy's on fire and, people have jobs. And so everyone votes for him. Now, Smith's a Southerner, so he gets the votes, but Hoover kind of cleans the floor. Now, with that said, though, Hoover was naive. Look at this quote. America today we're near a final triumph of poverty than other land. He had no idea what was coming his way, did he? Now, Hoover did not look at the government. He was, Republican. He didn't look at the government as the solution. And he failed to restore business confidence. Now, this is something that you're watching Trump do. Now, pay attention to this, right? Trump is going around and he is helping people out by giving them money, stimulating things. Hoover did do some of this. I don't want you to think that he wasn't involved. He did spend money to help the infrastructure, but he didn't go after the banks. He didn't help the big companies. He felt that, he called it this concept of volunteerism, that the wealthy should pick up the bootstraps of the poor. The problem is it didn't happen. The wealthy just held on to their money. Well, who's to blame? We started a video with that. Well, who you blame? Of course, the President of the United States is to blame. Now, that's not really fair, but this is how it works in our country. And so what people did is the amount of foreclosures increased in the United States exponentially, as you can imagine. And so one thing that Hoover does is, or people that lose their homes, they go to the Central Park. Actually, there was some at Pioneer Park too. They'd set up these shacks, and they called these shacks on the parks Hoovervilles, sort of a slap in the face. And then they would take their pockets inside out, and they would call them Hoover flags, because they have to blame somebody, so you blame the president. Another problem that comes around in the 1930s and during Hoover, sorry, I can't think of his name. Hoover's presidency is the Hawley Smoot tariff, and this thing really jacks up America. So I want you guys to watch part of this, give you some
wars.
insight.
They don't involve missiles, tanks, or guns, but they can cause a lot of damage. The United States learned this the hard way in the early 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Up until that time, the U.S. used tariffs, which are taxes on goods produced or grown abroad that are sold in the U.S., as a protectionist policy, or a policy aimed at shielding domestic industries from foreign competition. Tariffs increase the cost of foreign goods, making American goods relatively cheaper and therefore more attractive to customers. So, when farmers in the U.S. started struggling financially in the late 1920s, their representatives in Congress tried to help them with tariffs. Senator Reed Smoot of Utah and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon
Utah guy in there
sponsored a tariff bill that was originally meant to only raise tariffs on foreign agricultural products, to specifically help American farmers. But as the bill moved through Congress, other lawmakers tried to help their constituents, who worked in other industries, like manufacturing and mining. And by the time it passed through Congress, the bill was calling for 890 different tariffs to be raised on a huge variety of items, from clothespins to oil drums to bottle caps, raising tariffs by an estimated 20% on average. Opposition quickly formed. More than 1,000 American economists signed a petition urging President Herbert Hoover not to sign the bill. They claimed that raising so many tariffs
Pay attention
so high
here.
would be a major mistake. They predicted that it would harm most Americans once other countries started retaliating with their own tariffs, which would make American products more expensive and thus less competitive in foreign markets. Hoover ignored their warning and signed the bill. International outrage was swift. Some countries, including Spain, Mexico, and Canada, struck back with increased tariffs on American goods. This hit American farmers hard because exports to Canada had been a major part of their business. For example, before the tariffs, the U.S. was selling nearly 12 million eggs to Canada per year. But after Smoot-Hawley, that number plummeted by almost 99%, down to 170,000. Other American industries were hurt too. U.S. automobiles, iron, and steel exports dropped by over 80%, eliminating hundreds of millions of dollars worth of sales. The U.S. wasn't just harmed economically, though. There were also major foreign policy consequences. For example, Smoot-Hawley's tariffs on imported sugar crushed the Cuban economy, which depended on sugar sales. Cuban anger over the tariffs helped revolutionaries overthrow their U.S.-friendly government, and they replaced it with one that sought more independence from the U.S. Another consequence was that countries
and we're gonna talk about Cuba for sure.
responded to the U.S. tariffs with their own protectionist policies, against not just the U.S., but often everyone else as well. This reduced the total amount of international trade and deepened the Great Depression, which may have helped set the stage for World War II. But
Okay, so and that's really what I wanted to show you there. Hopefully everybody sees that. So Hawley-Smoot tariff didn't help. It just made things worse. It made it a global depression. Everybody's kind of reeling from this. It just didn't get better, and that was really what was the problem. And Hoover tried in some ways, but it was a tough time to be president. Think about this line that his Treasury Secretary said, Andrew Mellon. Enterprising people will pick up the wreck from less competent people. It just didn't happen. People just were poor, and they didn't, or they were trying to hoard their money. One of the worst things that happened is the bank failure. So after the crash in 1930, 744 banks fell, and that's a lot of banks that fell, and all 9,000 banks fell during the decade of the 1930s. 4,000 in 1933 alone. Some statistics to consider, maybe write down. This is why, and it's be important to ask your grandparents or about their parents, how many of your great-grandparents did not trust banks? this is a serious thing here. Because, imagine that you're somebody who invested some money in the stock market. You're just a farmer, you're trying to, get involved and it ends up failing. Well, you get nervous, right? So you go to the bank to get your cash out and you find this, it's boarded up bank and it's gone. Your bank doesn't have that money. The banks fail. So, now we have something called the FDIC, which we'll talk about where that comes from, which protects your money. It's why you could trust banks, right? They say the federal government, if your bank closes, will cut you a check tomorrow of $250,000. Up to $250,000, right? If you got more than that, then you want to diversify where you put your money. But your money is safe up to that point. Really, what is the tip of the iceberg? What is the tipping point for Hoover is the Bonus Army crisis in 1932. And I just want to show you a little clip about that so you see how this really brings an end to Hoover's presidency in some ways.
In 1932, Washington was under siege. The capital was surrounded by over 10,000 unemployed veterans of World War I from all over the country. Their only assets were the bonus certificates they'd been given after the war, which promised a cash bonus sometime in the future. They needed it now.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945. What brought you to Washington?
Want to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
I know who's made this country worth living in. It's just you fellas. Look, makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No. Take it from me, this is the greatest demonstration of Americanism we've ever had. Pure Americanism.
And, so you get these veterans, World War I veterans, who are promised cash at one point, right? They're given this bonus certificate. And when do they want it? Well, of course, they want it right now. They want it time's up, right? They've lost their job. So they want the government to pay out. Now, that's a lot of money, and the Congress doesn't pass it. So, what do you do?
President Hoover was left to deal with the veterans when the Senate rejected their demands. The marchers had stayed, camped out in central Washington.
It's war, the greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865.
I knew something was going to happen, that they might be attacked. And I had a press card. So I passed the police lines, and then I saw the soldiers advancing into the camp. And when confronted with this, the men all stood there and said, "Stand firm as long as you can." And they started throwing tear gas. I'd never seen anything like it. They systematically went down the line, burned up all the tents and all the possessions of the people there. I was thinking of Herbert Hoover when this happened, because his election was in 3 months. I thought this would be the finish of Hoover.
The orders of the president must be obeyed, and the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic Bonus Army in the shadow of the beautiful dome of the Capitol of the United States of America.
So not only did these poor people not get their pay, they lost all their stuff because they camped out in DC, and then they accidentally set fire to all their tents. So this ends up being a nightmare. Well, that leads us to the one and only FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is one of the more important presidents. He's definitely one of the more controversial presidents in our history. Not only does he lead us through the Great Depression, but World War II. He was either a love him or hate him guy. My grandpa was a farmer, loved FDR. My wife's grandpa was a businessman, hated FDR. And so you have, definitely differing opinions based on who you were. Well, one thing I like about FDR is he comes from money. He's the cousin of Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, we talked about. And he comes from money, he's from New York City. And everybody sort of expects him. And, from what I say, he's sort of this kid who's got a silver spoon in his mouth. And what that means is everything's been given to him his whole life. And he went to Harvard. He had private tutors. He did well. I imagine he was probably somewhat stuck up. He's wealthy. But something happened to him in 1922, I believe. He was on vacation in Canada, and he contracted polio. Now, polio does different things to different people. Some people might get sick a little bit. Some people die from it. Others, like FDR, they lose, they're paralyzed. And so he will be paralyzed from the waist down from this point on. Now, what it does for FDR is it sort of changes him a little bit as he becomes helpless in some ways. And so he sort of becomes a crusader for what he sees are the helpless people out there because he can relate to them. And he starts to see poor people. And so he spends the majority of his life looking at those that cannot help themselves. Now, it was pretty easy. He was the governor of New York. He was a big critic of Hoover. And it wasn't hard for him to get to the White House because of Hoover's unpopularity. Nobody liked him at this point. And, he blames Hoover for everything, which wasn't fair. And he says, I'm going to eliminate unnecessary functions of government. If everybody knows anything about FDR, it was the most ironic thing he's ever said. And, he easily gets to the White House. Let me show you this before I show you the video. I mean, it's not even close. 36 elections even worse. But, Hoover didn't have a chance. And of course, FDR then gets up in the podium inauguration day and he says one of the most, if not the most quoted 20th century statement ever. And let you hear it real quick.
Day of national consecration. And I am certain that on this day, my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat.
Okay, and so that's it right there, right? That's the speech everybody knows. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Which in some ways is true. There wasn't like there's this lurking enemy that was coming over us. It was our own fear, our own lack of faith in the business system, which we'll get to in just a second. Okay, so what he does is FDR gets moving fast. And he's taking this over, and it's not an easy responsibility. 1 quarter, 25% labor force out of work. A lot of men are just feeling this kind of loss of work, and they have nothing to do. So personal tolls there. So what does he do? Well, first thing, he closes the bank. He says the bank needs a holiday to kind of recover themselves. So let's back off the banks. And he says every week during the first 100 days, I'm going to give you an update of how the great things we're doing to try to fix our country. It's called fireside chats. And he was like this grandpa figure, which he's going to get on the radio and talk to you about all the things that are great that's happening. So, he's going to start passing legislation and bills. Then he says, I'm going to revive 2 things, industry and agriculture. And I'm going to give them relief. And how am I going to do this? Well, what he's really saying is I'm going to give you more federal government. Think about opening that door even more, right? Think about giving more money, more power to the federal government to fix your problems. This is why a lot of people don't like FDR, because he's kind of making the government bigger. And this brings us to what you probably heard before, his very famous New Deal. And the New Deal was all ways that we're going to fix the crisis of the Great Depression. And so he starts to bring up something called the alphabet agencies. These alphabet because there's these acronyms here. And the idea is, okay, we're going to start these companies and their job is going to provide jobs for the American people. The CCC we'll talk about a little bit, the FERA, the PWA, the AAA, the TVA, the NIRA. All of these are companies created by the federal government to employ all of these out-of-work people to get them jobs. And, so this is good, right? I want you to think about this. American people are watching this. They read the first thing in the newspaper. 4 million jobs are going to be there. But we have to understand what this is, right? Don't get lost in this. This is good. Look at the amount of money he's going to spend here. But who's hiring him, right? This isn't businesses. This is the government. That's a different employer, isn't it? Keep that in mind. Well, let's take a look at a couple of things that they do. Let's take the AAA. This is one of the most fascinating things that happens. So this just shows you about FDR's kind of philosophy that it is fair. So you've got people in the Midwest. They have so much food because no one's buying it. No one's selling. The middleman's not getting it anymore. And they don't know what to do with it. Meanwhile, in New York City, you've got all of these people lined up just trying to get a bowl of soup. So FDR's plan is, why don't we figure this out for them? So the United States government will spend by 6 million piglets, little pigs, to turn them to can them, and feed the American people. They're going to fight. They also spend money. They also give money to farmers to burn their crops. There's an oversupply there, so let's burn them to bring the demand there. You see how crazy this is? But this is the idea of FDR. One of the more fascinating groups that applies to Utah quite a bit is the Civilian Conservation Corps. Now, this was created, it was usually 18 and 19-year-old young men. And what they would do is they'd hire them to go out to fix trails, to improve land, build ranger stations, build roads. If you ever like to hike, you've probably been on a CCC trail that they built. So a lot of them brought out here. But the idea was, it wasn't really to do anything. It was just to get money in their hands. Let me give you a perfect, I love this example. This is a crazy story. So CCC's over here. And the American people, or the people here in Utah, they're looking for jobs. So the United States government says, we're looking for a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. So they bring these 18 and 19-year-olds, and they take them on a bus, and they send them out in the middle of the Great Salt Lake Desert. He said, we want a hole. We want the hole to be about 20 feet wide, 10 feet deep. So they're sitting there digging day in, day out. And they dig this huge hole. And then they come back, and people start getting them the money. And the idea was, okay, here's $25, keep $5 for yourself, $20 go home to your family, right? The idea is that spend the money. Once you spend the money, don't save it, right? Get the economy stimulated. Okay, then they bust in a bunch of other 18, 19-year-olds. And they said, okay, there's this huge hole on the middle of the Great Salt Lake Desert. We want you to fill it in. So y'all gave them shovels, and they spent time to fill them in and paid them money. Again, it's not the type of work. It's just work. It's trying to get people money. That's the idea of the CCC. And so this is sort of the key of FDR's plan. Get the money started. That's going to help us out. I'm going to show you this little clip here. This is actual footage of the CCC here. Some of these 18 and 19-year-olds, young men, they're excited, they're leaving home, right? And this also gives them purpose. Instead of sitting around because nobody has a job, they're getting an opportunity to bring money home to their family and do something, be part of something bigger. And so here they are. And I think it shows you some footage of what they're going to do here. Then thousands and thousands. I think there's 14,000 or so, or 1,400, sorry, different camps of CCC, sort of places of rejuvenating the countryside throughout the nation. So they would set them up in these tents here, and you can see that they're in the forest, right? The idea is we're sort of improving conservation. Here they're building some sort of podium, some sort of building maybe, right? Some sort of ranger station perhaps. Look at, they're in the middle of nowhere. Again, you're just hiring them. It's not like this needs to get done. It's just stuff that whatever, right? And you can still see some, like I said, some CCC. So here's some of these guys are sending, I think they're sending these guys out to go do the trails and stuff. And so, here they are, right? Out in the middle of nowhere, improving the land, whatever that means, for recreation. Building fences was a big one. You ever been on these hikes and you see these big fences out there? Look at these picnic tables they're putting in here. You know, that was a big part of it as well. But I think you get the idea. I thought they had some. Yeah, here we go. Kind of tells you about.
Plenty to do clearing trails of underbrush to prevent forest fires and gathering up driftwood around the great projects. They're a great thing for city boys. Beautiful background makes work a real pleasure for less used to the drab outlines of the tenements. A far cry from the roar of the subway to that of Old Faithful, most famous geyser in the world.
Right, and I mean, isn't that sort of the idea? Not like they need to pick up the wood, but go pick up this wood just in case there's no forest fires. You know, we'll pay you money. Okay, so what's the problem here? Because unemployment, it doesn't get better. The Great Depression's still happening, and this is where people criticize FDR. You know, here's the thing. Well, let me get to that. Let me talk about the criticism first. Okay, so let's see the problem here. Okay, so you have now our system. Well, if everybody remembers, this is how the system works, right? You produce something, you need to hire people. People buy things, right? There's more demand for it. You build more, it keeps going. This shut down, right? This shut down. And so it shut down the whole system. Well, what the government's trying to do, what FDR is he's trying to come in here and he's trying to put the government right here, right? Creating jobs. He's trying to put it here. He's trying to increase consumerism. He's trying to be this right here. He's trying to say, we'll be the government. The problem is that that's not how the system works. Most of this works because of confidence from the consumer. There's no confidence still. Businesses are still stuck. This is just the government fulfilling sort of what we call the invisible hand that Adam Smith calls for. But it doesn't fix the depression. It just prolongs it in some ways. So he's going to step it up. He really focuses on what he calls his 3 R's. I'm going to relieve you, I'm going to recover it, and I'm going to reform you. And that's what's going to fix this all. The problem, again, is that it doesn't really work that well. I wanted to give you a taste of FDR, how far he was willing to go with this whole depression thing.
It is 3 months, my friends, since I have talked to the people of this country about our national problems. But during this period, many things have happened. And I am glad to say that the major part of them have greatly helped the well-being of the average citizen. In the short space of these few months, I am convinced that at least 4 million have been given employment. Or saying it another way, 40% of those seeking work have found it. That does not mean, my friends, that I am satisfied or that you are satisfied that our work is ended. We have a long way to go, but we are on the way. We come to the relief, for a moment, of those who are in danger of losing their farms or their homes. I have publicly asked that the foreclosure on farms and chattels and homes be delayed until every mortgagor in the country has had full opportunity to take advantage of federal credit. And I make the further request that if there is any family in the United States about to lose its home or its farm, that family should telegraph at once, either to the Farm Credit Administration or the Home Loan Corporation in Washington, requesting their help. I do not hesitate to say that although the prices of many products of the farm have gone up, and although many farm families are better off than they were last year, I am not satisfied. It is definitely a part of our policy to increase the rise and to extend it to those products that have as yet felt no benefit. If we cannot do this one way, we will do it another. But do it, we will.
And that is FDR right there. Now, 2 important things I hope you caught right there. I'll tell you. Listen, this is how far he goes. Let's say you are about ready to lose your home. Foreclose is what we call it. You can't pay for it anymore. FDR says, send me a letter and I'll pay for your mortgage. Now, that's crazy. That's completely dismantling the American system. That's borderline socialism, isn't it? You can't pay for it, we'll pay for it for you. You know, that's how far FDR is willing to go here. Think about what he says there. We will do it one way or another, but do it we will. And that's his philosophy, no matter how far he has to go. Well, what's happening in America? Well, you know, actually, a lot of people, you have people on the right that said this dude's a socialist, we can't trust him. On the left, it's fast. You got people that are calling for even more reform. This guy, Huey Long, is fascinating. He's governor and senator for Louisiana. He's calling for a complete redistribution of the wealth. And he is going to run as a third candidate as a socialist. And his ideas are very similar to Bernie, that we're going to get money, we're going to get all this stuff back to the American people. I want to give you just a taste of Huey Long. This is him right here, because he is a fascinating speaker, fascinating man. He'll be assassinated before he can even run. These ideas are so radical. But I want you to hear just a little bit of Huey as he's talking about sharing the wealth. It's really fascinating.
According to the tables which we have assembled, it is our estimate that 4% of the American people own 85% of the wealth of America, and that over 70% of the people of America don't own enough to pay the debts that they owe. How many men ever went to a barbecue and would let one man take off the table what's intended for 9/10 of the people to eat? The only way you'll ever be able to feed the balance of the people is to make that man come back and bring back some of that grub he ain't got no business with. Now, how are you going to feed the balance of the people? What's Morgan and Baruch and Rockefeller and Mellon going to do with all that grub? They can't eat it. They can't wear the clothes. They can't live in the house. Give them a yacht. Give them a palace. Send them to Reno and give them a new wife when they want it, if that's what they want. But when they've got everything on the God's living earth that they can eat and they can wear and they can live in, and all that their children can live in and wear and eat and all their children's children can use, then we got to call Mr. Morgan and Mr. Mellon and Mr. Rockefeller back and say, come back here. Put that stuff back on this table here that you took away from here, that you don't need. Leave something else for the American people to consume. And that's the program.
So you can see, just want to give you a taste of Long there. What a fascinating character, right? And what the Great Depression gives us, and what times of really, I think, hard times gives us, is people with new ideas, what we call extreme ideas. It gives them opportunities. And Huey Long's an opportunist. He sees this as his way of getting in. Well, it's not working after 100 days. Maybe it is in some ways, but in some ways it's not. And so he's going to shift left even more. And what he identifies as the second New Deal. He puts a Social Security Act, which most people like this, right? This is the idea that if you're 65 and older, I think it's 67 now, but it used to be 65 for years, the government's going to send you a check. We want you to retire. And the idea was you got these old people that are working in the 1930s, that they need to get out of there. We'll take care of you. Let's let young people have jobs. That's the idea of Social Security. The WPA, we're going to invest even more. And this time, not just building out in the middle of nowhere. We're going to build homes and schools and, buildings and whatever it is, So, let me give you an example of the WPA. What is this? Of course, this is Ogden High. Ogden High is a WPA project. And if you've ever wondered why you're driving by Ogden High on Harris and you look at this, you're like, why is it so freaking big? But why does this look like this? Well, it was because they didn't care how much money they were spending. They were working. They were having people work. So they put all this nice ornate detail in there. It was money in people's jobs or in people's hands. And that's all that mattered. So, of course, they're going to make it big and exuberant. Private companies aren't going to spend money like this today. Most of your schools are all about cutting costs. But that wasn't Ogden High for Social Security now, So Well, but the problem is, again, it's the government coming in. It's not businesses. And so one thing that happens is businesses that do hire, it's really tough because you would line up outside and there would be, this fence that would divide it. It'd be hundreds of people. And they'd look around and say, we're taking 3, and they point randomly at 3 people. And that would be the people hired. Now, so this is an example here. This guy, he got chosen for the job. So what's going to happen? Well, he's going to beat up. We can pick somebody else. This guy can't do it. I mean, what happens is this sort of chaos, this uncertainty leads to violence. Now, I'm not saying we're there yet, but I have seen some interesting things happen at places like grocery stores where people have lost a little bit of their humanity because of this uncertain time. People have yelled at each other. There's fighting about things. Last roll of toilet paper. We are living in a similar time period, aren't we, in some ways? Okay, so let's, we're almost out of time. We've been going for a while, but we'll shut this down in a second. But I just want to talk about Eleanor for a second. I love Eleanor Roosevelt. She's a phenomenal person. And FDR's, most of his New Deal is looking at white men. That's who he's trying to get white men back to work. Eleanor is like, look, I think that the person who doesn't have any jobs at all are the African Americans, Mexican Americans. And so she goes specifically at helping them. And that's an important thing to understand. Is her role. She is as important as any first lady has been in the social justice causes and helping people out. Okay, so the Great Depression still happening. Here's the big question mark. Great Depression still going on. Still rough time period. Look at this landslide. How come he's winning if unemployment rates aren't going down? Well, here it is. This is the big reason why. Because despite the fact that maybe things aren't great now, or the economy isn't doing better, it feels better. And isn't that what matters? It's the security FDR offers. It's the idea that you can go work. It's the idea that you feel comfortable with this guy on the radio telling you about how things are getting better. And what people needed then was comfort. And that's what FDR offered him. Now, did he fix the Great Depression? Did he solve it by the New Deal? No, he did not. But what he did was he brought people comfort. He brought people stability and hope. And that's what they were looking for during this time. And I would argue we're looking for that, aren't we? And I would say as you watch this election come forward in 2020, whatever it's going to look like, I think the American people want stability. They want optimism. They want somebody who's going to give them something positive, even if it maybe is it fair to say maybe if it's misleading a little? I don't know. It's an argument, something to think about. Okay, so what we're going to call a new Democratic Party comes in. And this is very important. So African Americans, immigrants, urban masses, which today, we're going to see the shift bigger in the 1960s, but it starts here. Today, all 3 of these vote almost entirely Democrat. That shift's happening with FDR. It's going to take total control, total change is going to happen in about 1964 with Johnson, 65. But 36, FDR starting to move that pendulum. African Americans have always voted Republicans. Immigrants, primarily Republicans. Urban city people, always a Republican. But since the Democrats, since FDR and Eleanor have been focusing on these people, you see that shift. That's an important thing to understand. By 1937, FDR's rethinking everything. It's not working. How can we do this? He's trying different social reforms. How can he fix this? And what's happening is at the same time, things are getting a little bit dicey in Europe. So keep in mind of that. We're sort of paying attention to some of this turmoil that's happening, the rise of this Nazi party we'll talk about. On February 5th, 1937, FDR announces his most controversial plan. There have always been 9 judges in the Supreme Court. Roosevelt wants to put 15 in. Now, if you remember, the Supreme Court is the highest court of the land, and it's the president that gets to appoint them. So Roosevelt's literally trying to change the Constitution. He wants 15 of them in there to pack the court with people who agree with the New Deal. This is where people thought he went too far. You cannot change how many people are in the Supreme Court. Okay, we'll come back to FDR and sort of how this thing settles. But the last thing I want to leave you with today, so we're almost out of time, is I want to talk about New Deal in the Southwest, because you want to talk about the economic problems that are happening in the world. Well, the Southwest is also dealing with ecological issues as well. And the Dust Bowl is an example of that. From 1935 to 1940, dust will be the problem here. And there's a couple reasons why this is. We'll talk about it, but there is a perfect storm happening in this region here that leads these giant dust storms. Well, this happens because of deep plowing, which they had plowed so much, they've eliminated all those native grasses, and that soil has been replaced. Now, if you do not replenish soil, if you use it over and over again, it turns into just dirt. You know, if you have a chance, go outside and you pick out some topsoil, really dense stuff with those nutrients, organisms in there, and then pick up some dirt and throw it in the air and see what happens, right? That dirt's going to go flying. Topsoil will fly, but not as far. And you are literally depriving and kind of ripping out all the nutrients out of the soil, and nothing's holding it down. On top of it, you have these crazy high records of temperature up into the 80s and 90s. Quick clip here to talk about it.
The steel plow was the only tool that could break the plains. It had been a country of cattlemen here since the Civil War. This new weapon in the farmer's hands cut the prairie grass aside. The plow and the reaper made wheat the king as the new century dawned. But what was going wrong was that the huge and growing demand for wheat as the United States entered the war in Europe in 1917 meant an excessive unleashing of this new technology on a soil vulnerable both to erosion by the incessant winds and to the frequent droughts of this dry interior. Quite simply, a fragile land was being flogged to death. By 1929, an area the size of England was under wheat. It was a technological revolution, but in 1930, nature struck back. As the years of drought set in and the winds swept the plains as they had always done, the failed crops were not able to fix the soil as the tough prairie grasses once did. A nation watched as the plains blew away. The new technologists were abandoned by their own land. In one black blizzard, 5 million tons of soil took to the air over Wichita, Kansas. Another swept from Montana to the Mississippi.
Okay, and so you can see here what's happening, these causes, and it leads to this horrible thing, you know, drought with no rainfall, and you get these giant dust storms, and they just swallow people. Now imagine the worst snowstorm you've seen, and imagine it being dust. That's what you're dealing with here. And it really chokes people, you know, and it covers the land. There's nothing left. These poor little kids suffering from what we call dust pneumonia. Some of them die from it. It's burying these cars. I love this picture in Garden City, you know, comparing one photo from the next, just in 15 minutes. It looks like the sun's going down. No, this is dust. Well, let me leave you on this one concept here. Look, it's a tough time, and we're struggling, but we sort of keep it together. And this is a very strong time for photographs, literature. Ansel Adams becomes a very important picture or photographer with various pictures of the outdoors. The Migrant Mother, almost I think there's like a Mona Lisa take about her face, right? Her face demonstrates, to me, resilience, determination, as much as it does sorrow and fear. And that's the American people. Remember that we're going to come out of this defeating the Nazis, defeating the Japanese. I mean, so we're on our knees. We got torn down, but we're going to come back up. I started with Steinbeck. You know, this guy who was this great artist or writer during the Great Depression. And so I thought what I would want to leave you with is just a little interview about his thoughts about the Dust Bowl and about the Great Depression. Because 2.5 million people leave the Dust Bowl. And this is why they all go to California. And that's what the Grapes of Wrath's about. Let's just listen to him for a few minutes here. And then we'll call it and we'll move on. But this gives us good insight from one of the great writers in American history. This is the interview they did with him a while ago.
I'm curious to know if you've ever returned to the Dust Bowl in the central part of this country to investigate any changes in the conditions since the time that you were there doing the research for your novel.
I have not gone back through Arkansas and Oklahoma, which is called the Dust Bowl area, with any idea of research, but I have been through there since and have looked at the ground that I had looked at before.
Did you find any striking changes?
Oh, yes, I found a great many changes. I found that the land was cared for in a different way entirely. I think that when the first of our great dust storms had caused the depopulation of the land happened, that there were no facilities to take care of such a tragedy. When I wrote The Grapes of Wrath, I was filled naturally with certain angers, and certain angers at people who were doing injustices to other people, or so I thought. I realize now that everyone was caught in the same trap. If you remember, we had a depression at that time. The depression caught us without the ability to take care of it. It took a long time for us to develop the agencies to take care of such economic difficulties. When the dust came up, people were starving and they had no place to go. Naturally, they went to in a direction where they would not suffer from cold. They went toward California. They came in their thousands to California. And what did they meet? They met people who were terrified, number one, of depression, and were horrified at the idea that great numbers of indigent people were being poured on them to be taken care of. They could only be taken care of by taxation. Taxes were already high, and there wasn't much money about. They reacted perfectly normally. They became angry. And when you become angry, you fight what you're angry at.
Okay, so just a little taste of Steinbeck there, talking about what people left, why people left. Sort of. Okay, guys, so, there's a lot of good pieces of information for us that I think we can think about for us today, how we can become better Americans. What I want you to do now is I want you to attack this, right? What were 5 ideas that we talked about today that resonate with you? I'll give you an opportunity. I'll post this and keep it up. You'll have to do this one and one about World War II. Hope you guys are doing okay. If you have any questions, let me know. That's it.